All right, sorry about that. Had to get something figured out back there. Appreciate Pastor's willingness to jump in and cover that today. Anyways, as I was saying, working our way through the first 3 chapters here. We were at number 3 there, boldly follow God's leading. When Nehemiah went and talked to King Artaxerxes with his pretty big ask, really. Number 4, assessing the needs. He spent his time figuring out exactly what he needed to do before he recruited any help. And then lastly, number 5, he used God's truth to motivate others. I think it's important as we go through this. You know, this course is written from the perspective of learning from Nehemiah as a godly leader, and that's great. There's a lot that we can learn from Nehemiah, some great truths, some great principles, but I think it's important we keep in mind and we understand as we go through this, Nehemiah isn't ultimately the hero of the story, right? Nehemiah is just a man that God used, and I think that's important to remember. None of us can really totally relate to Nehemiah, right? Regardless of what position of leadership you may or may not have in your life, you can't relate to what he was going through entirely, right? His challenge is totally different. It was funny to be studying for this while we were organizing the workday for the K House, and I found myself thinking about all the stuff that had to be done at the K House, and then studying this and thinking, well, okay, the K House really isn't that big compared to this. I guess it's all a matter of comparison. But anyways, ultimately, our ultimate hero here of the story, as it were, is God, right? God guiding Nehemiah, God providing for the Israelites, God blessing their work, God protecting them, and we'll continue to see that today. But in number 5 there, he used God's truth to motivate others. And what's going on here? I think we're on the wrong thing there, Pastor. There we go. At number 6, this is from last week, we saw delegate tasks to responsible workers. Today, we're going to move on to... There we go. Yeah, okay. I'm sorry. I thought I had the wrong slide up there for a second. Today, we're going to move on to facing opposition. When the task was difficult enough all on its own, and then more opposition came to make it more difficult for Nehemiah. How did he respond, and what can we learn from that? We'll get to that in a moment. Before we do, would you recite with me last week's memory verse? Nehemiah 4:6. So built we the wall, and all the wall was joined together unto the half thereof, for the people had a mind to work. And we saw that the last couple weeks, right? The people having a mind to work. Not being overwhelmed, but rather getting to work because they understood that it was for God's glory. God would help them. Nehemiah had arranged all the earthly help they could hope for from the king, and now it was time to get to work. So today, we're going to move on, as I said, to this facing opposition. Nehemiah and the Israelites had a difficult task all on its own. Rebuilding the walls, we talked about the length of some of the walls last week. It would have been a tremendous task. Remember, one portion of the wall that one group had to fix was just over 5.5 football fields long, which is, if that were the whole job, it would be a huge job. But that's only one small set, one chunk, I should say, of the wall. So on top of all the difficulties of just the difficulties of building the wall itself, they also had this opposition. Now, before we began, I handed out a bunch of pieces of paper to different people to do some scripture reading for me. The reason was there is a lot of scripture in today's lesson, and I thought my voice would get tired of reading, and your ears would get tired of hearing me. So I would recruit you to help. As a matter of fact, Rick, you weren't here when I handed them out. Would you take one for us? Oh, I actually got one more. Would you be willing to read a couple verses for us? Would you give us one of those back there? Excellent, Mark. Thank you. All right, so we'll start here at the beginning of chapter number 4, and I didn't keep track of who had which passages, but whoever has Nehemiah 4, verses 1 through 6, if you'd start us off, please, Don.
Fox go up, he shall even break down their stone wall. Hear, O our God, for we are despised, and turn their reproach upon their own head, and give them for a prey in the land of captivity. And cover not their iniquity, and let not their sin be blotted out from before thee. For they have provoked thee to anger before the builders. So built we the wall, and all the wall was joined together unto the half thereof, for the people had a mind to work.
So way back here in verse 1 and through verse 3, we're reminded of some enemies that we met way back near the beginning of this story, beginning of this account, right? We see here specifically Sanballat and Tobiah who are upset. Sanballat was very angry about this. He was angry about the Jews rebuilding this city. He goes through this whole long list here in verse 2. What are they doing? Are they going to fortify themselves? Are they going to bring back sacrifices to worship of their God? Are they going to finish this whole thing in a day? What are they doing? And they're moving much more quickly than he probably anticipated. And he was perhaps shocked and definitely here angry. It's interesting the Bible here uses the word wrath. It carries the wrath, It carries the idea of a burning anger. He was really upset about this. And it's kind of interesting to wonder, why? Why was he so upset? Anybody have any ideas? Why would he be so upset about this? Like they're not attacking him. It's kind of interesting. The book I had, speculated that the Jewish influence being rebuilt and the city of Jerusalem growing in strength would mess up Samaria's trade routes, and people would go through Jerusalem, and he was perhaps concerned it would impact his wealth, his own country's well-being, and he wanted to ensure that wouldn't happen, which really shouldn't be a surprise. Right? Oftentimes, anger is caused by things like jealousy or pride or fear, and it should be no surprise that that's what's happening here in the life of Sanballat, and he is angry. But it's interesting here, the tactic that he and Tobiah use. The tactic they use is ridicule. Notice in this verses 1 through 6, you don't see any fighting. There's no call to arms. There's no attack on the city. There's nothing like that. There's just ridicule. Okay? Rather than engage in open fighting, they ridiculed and mocked the Jews' efforts. So just to kind of brainstorm with y'all for a moment, why do you suppose an enemy would try to ridicule, would try to mock, instead of just fighting and getting it over with? Any thoughts? Yeah? Okay, kind of get inside people's heads and, yeah. Rick?
See what support they actually have.
Okay, yeah. How?
Even from the Jews themselves.
Yeah, they don't know how committed the Jews really are, and maybe some will follow us instead. Agree with us, I should say. Anybody else? I came up with a few reasons myself. One was one that kind of guys already kind of mentioned, which is it's pretty effective to get inside people's heads sometimes, right? You hear sometimes in sports, I wouldn't endorse this. I certainly wouldn't encourage our high school kids to do this, right? But on the professional level, sometimes you hear guys engage in a lot of trash talk. They say unkind things to each other, putting each other down, insulting either the person or the way they play the game, hoping that somehow that will get that person to not perform as well, okay? I grew up in Minnesota watching the Minnesota Timberwolves as a kid, and I don't know how to word this exactly. My favorite basketball player to have on my team was a guy named Kevin Garnett. He played for the Timberwolves. I was glad he was on our team. My guess is just about every team hated him because he was well known for this, right? He often engaged in trash talk, tried to make the other players feel bad about themselves. I'm not endorsing that as a way of life, okay? I'm just saying this is why people do that, right? If they get inside your head, you get distracted by what they're saying, and you're not able to perform as well as you otherwise might be able to. And secondly, it's certainly easier than fighting. There's no risk here, right? They're not going to get struck by a sword. They're not going to get hit by an arrow. And perhaps you all have heard the sayings, right? Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never harm me, which I think we all know is just blatantly untrue, right? Words can cut deep sometimes. And that's what they were trying to do here with these verbal attacks, this ridicule. And also, I kind of wonder if they didn't want to anger the king. If they had outright attacked Jerusalem, even though King Artaxerxes gave Nehemiah his support, it might cause trouble for them, right? So they may have been hesitant to actually engage in fighting, but surely the king won't punish them, the king won't judge them just for talking, right? So rather than getting engaged in fighting, they engaged in this ridicule. And that can be hard to hear sometimes. It can get in your head. It can make you second guess yourself. Maybe I am wrong. Maybe this wall isn't strong enough. Maybe we can't accomplish this as quickly as we thought we could. So it's important here to see Nehemiah's response. Starting in verses 1 through 3, we see the attacks, right? What do you think you're doing? This wall is terrible. If a small fox were to climb on it, your wall would crumble. In verse 4, though, we see Nehemiah's response. Real quickly, in a word, what was his first response? Prayer. Okay? This should come as no surprise to us, right? We see this happening over and over again in Nehemiah's life. When a challenge comes, when a trial comes, his first instinct is prayer. Again, a valuable lesson, a valuable pattern for us. Nehemiah probably knew that he couldn't really do this on his own. He and the Jews really couldn't accomplish this task. It was too big for them. They had too many enemies. And understanding that, he trusted God to provide for their needs. He trusted God to help them build the wall, to protect them, because he knew they couldn't do it themselves. Okay? So his first response was prayer, and then the second part, let's get back to work. We're not going to let their words stop us. We're not going to let their taunting stop us. In verse 4 and 5, they prayed, and verse 6, they get back to work. That was actually our memory verse from last week, right? They had a mind to work. So the first attack here was all verbal, trying to undermine their confidence and frighten them and intimidate them. And rather than being intimidated, they put their faith in their God, the one who they knew could deliver them, and they got back to work. Okay, so that was the first attack. And I would love to tell you that then Sanballat and Tobiah realized, well, this didn't work, and they went back home and gave up. But I think we all know the rest of the story. That wasn't their next move here. So the second episode, I think I broke this one up into two different readings, right? I think somebody's got the beginning of this section, and someone has the second part. Somebody have 7 through 12? Larry, would you read that for us? Chapter 4, verses 7 through 12.
But it came to pass that when Sanballat and Tobiah and Arabian and the Ammonites and the Asherites heard that the walls of Jerusalem were made up, and that the branches began to be stopped, then they were very wroth, and conspired all of them together to come and to fight against Jerusalem and to hinder it. Nevertheless, we made our prayer unto God, and set a watch against them day and night because of them. And Judah said, the strength of the bearers of the burdens is decaying, and there is much rubbish, so that we are not able to build the wall. And our adversaries said that they shall not know, neither shall see, till we come in the midst among them, and slay them, and cause the work to cease. It came to pass that when the Jews which dwelt by them came, they said unto us 10 times, in all places which ye shall return unto us, they will be unused.
So we have here our next attack. Okay? Our second attack is trying to discourage the workers. Again, they're not engaging in open warfare, but they're kind of threatening. They're intimidating these workers and trying to scare the workers. Though the thought of having to be prepared for an attack while building the wall would have been, I can imagine them just feeling defeated in some ways. We can't do this. This job was already so big. This job is already so hard. They're already overwhelmed. They are probably getting pretty tired doing this day after day after day. And now on top of all that, they're scared because their enemies are multiplying around them. As a matter of fact, I've got here a map. In just a minute, I'll share with you. We see the response here. Nehemiah set up guards, but even with that being the case, this attack of theirs was seemingly at least somewhat effective, right? In verse 12, the Jews came and talked about the fact that no matter well, at the end of verse 12 there, it says, from all places whence he shall return unto us, they will be upon you. They're all around us, Nehemiah. This is kind of frightening. We're surrounded. How are we going to accomplish this task? Now, when they say surrounded, this is where this map might be helpful, right? So we've got here Jerusalem right near the center of our map, right? Let's just real quickly go over these people that they are. I'm sorry, I'm on the wrong spot here, I think. So we've got the people that are against them. We've got the Samaritans in the north. We've got the Amorites on the east. Sorry, my pointer there is drifting. The Amorites on the east, the Arabs on the south, and the Ashdodites on the west. They are completely surrounded on all sides by the enemy. And that's a bad place to be, right? I am not a military expert. I'm not very well versed in military strategy, but I do know you don't want to be surrounded by your enemies. And that's where they found themselves, and they were intimidated. They were scared. And again, I think we are especially susceptible to feeling tempted to quit the hard work when we're in this situation, right? It was already a hard job. They're already worn out. Now they're scared on top of it. They may be tempted. Nehemiah, let's just stop. If we stop now, they might leave us alone. They might come and break down the wall we were built, but hopefully they won't hurt us as long as we stop. That may have been a real temptation for some. So how did Nehemiah respond? Okay, again, with faith and with strategy. With faith and with strategy. Verses 13 through 23. Who had that paper?
Therefore, set I the lower places behind the wall, and on the higher places. I even set the people after their families, with their swords, their spears, and their bows. And I looked, and rose up, and said unto the nobles, and to the rulers, and to the rest of the people, be not afraid of them. Remember the Lord, which is great and terrible, and fight for your brethren, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your houses. And it came to pass, when our enemies heard it, it was known unto us, and God had brought their counsel to naught, that we returned all of us to the wall, every one unto his work. It came to pass from that time forth, that the half of my servants wrought in the work, and the other half of them held both the spears, the shields, and the bows, and the habergeons, and the rulers who were behind all the house of Judah. They which builded on the wall, and they that bare burdens, with those that laid it, every one with one of his hands wrought in the work, and with the other hand held a weapon. For the builders, every one had his sword girded by his side, and so builded. And he that sounded the trumpet was by me. And I said unto the nobles, and to the rulers, and to the rest of the people, the work is great and large. We are separated upon the wall, one far from another. In what place therefore ye hear the sound of the trumpet, resort ye thither unto us. Our God shall fight for us. So we labored in the work. Half of them held the spears from the rising of the morning till the stars appeared. Likewise, at the same time said I unto the people, let every one with his servant lodge within Jerusalem, that in the night they may be a guard to us, and labor on the day. So neither I, nor my brethren, nor my servants, nor the men of the guard which followed me, none of us put off our clothes, saving that everyone put them off for washing.
So in response to this threat, thank you, Arden, we see Nehemiah's response. And we see I've got it abbreviated into 2 main points, right? Faith and strategy. The faith we really see in verses 13 and 14, at least where it's first clearly spoken, clearly presented there. In verse 14, he tells everyone not to be afraid. Why? Because they're so strong, because they're so mighty, because their walls are so great. Because of God, right? The end of verse 14. Remember the Lord, which is great and terrible. Ultimately, their confidence wasn't in their swords. Their confidence wasn't in this new wall. Their confidence was in God. So he helped to protect the people by giving them confidence in God. God called us to do this. We're his people. He'll enable us to do this. There's a song we sing sometimes in the choir. called grace. That's a very poetic way of putting this, where it says God's will not lead us where his grace cannot keep us. It's an encouraging thought. A really short, succinct way of saying if God's called you to do something, he'll enable you to do it. And the same thing here is true for these Jews. In rebuilding the wall, this attack failed. It's interesting to me in the last attack, there were some who were scared. The second attack, it doesn't seem to be working at all. They have faith in God, and they're going to be prepared. Now, it isn't just faith and then laziness, right? He does have faith in God. He does trust God, but he understands that he also has to do some of the work to protect his people. God's going to use their work to protect them, okay? God isn't just going to drop a magical bubble around Jerusalem and keep them safe. He could, right? We've seen places in the Bible where he used his angels to kill Israel's enemies. He could do that. But generally speaking, he's going to protect his people by giving them the ability to protect themselves, right? And that's what he does here for the Israelites. So Nehemiah then comes up with detailed plans. And if we can summarize the plans, they're basically everyone is armed all the time, including the people who are building, the people who are helping with labors. Everyone is armed all the time. I'm trying to imagine what that would be like to be picking up and moving these huge, heavy stones, trying to get them into place. Some of you are sharing that you've seen them and how massive they are, while also making sure you've got your sword at your side and you're ready to draw it at a moment's notice. Okay? So everyone is armed, everyone is ready to fight, but since they're so spread out, there's also some around Jerusalem that have a trumpet. And Nehemiah says, if we hear the attack coming, we all rally to where the attack is coming from, because we're spread thin right now, right? So we're going to all go and help wherever the attack, wherever the attack happens, to defend off the enemy here. So we see again this two-pronged approach, right? We're going to have faith in God, and we're going to do what we can, okay? Which I think is a huge help to us, a blessing to us, right? When we have trials, we don't know how we're going to handle them. We don't know how we're going to accomplish them. We can use the same twofold plan of Nehemiah's. Don't mean you have to carry a sword on your hip all the time. But it does mean we can have faith in God and his ability, and then do what we can do. Nehemiah is a great example of that. He encouraged the workers to trust in God, and the workers, including Nehemiah, continued on doing what they're doing. It shows his dedication at the very end of the verse, right? Or very end of the chapter, excuse me. He didn't relax. They never took time to get changed out of dirty clothes and change into relaxing clothes. He said, we were wearing the same clothes all the time because we were always working. Okay, he makes a concession. We took them off to wash them sometimes, and I think everyone around them would be grateful for that. But besides that, we were wearing our work clothes all the time. We were fully engaged in the task at hand. And again, I would love to say Sanballat and Tobiah decide, we can't beat them. We're going to give up. We're going to leave. But sadly, this is not the end of the story. There's still two more threats here to look at. Who had Nehemiah 5, 1 through 5? Pastor, would you read that for us?
And there was a great cry of the people and of their wives against their brethren the Jews. For there were that said, we, our sons, and our daughters are men. Therefore we take up corn for them, that we may eat and live. Some also there were that said, we have mortgaged our land, vineyards, and houses, that we might buy corn because of the dearth. There were also that said, we have borrowed money for the king's tribute, and that upon our lands and vineyards. Yet now our flesh is as the flesh of our brethren, our children as their children. And lo, we bring into bondage our sons and our daughters to be servants. And some of our daughters are brought unto bondage already. Neither is it in our power to redeem them, for other men have our lands and vineyards.
This attack, this opposition to the work is totally different from the first two. This is not a verbal, a mental attack from an outside force trying to intimidate the Israelites. Instead, sadly, this one is internal, dealing with some greedy Jews. And I think as you look through history, we see that oftentimes internal strife, internal division is the greatest threat to a people, right? If you feel like we are all on the same page, we all have the same goal, and we're going to work together, people can accomplish many things. They can overcome many enemies. But when a people are divided amongst themselves and they don't feel like they can have a unity to work together to fight against the enemy or to accomplish their task, that's destructive. We see that even in the teaching of Jesus. In Mark. In Mark chapter 3. In Mark chapter 3, he warns of this, and his context is a little bit different. He's responding to some of the Jews after he casts out a demon. But nonetheless, he says, if a kingdom be divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. And if a house be divided against itself, that house cannot stand. Such an interesting quote to me because it often reminds me of the time I was driving down I-5 into Tacoma. And there was a giant billboard on the side of the road that said, a house divided against itself cannot stand. Now that's great. Underneath it, it did not say Mark 3. It said Abraham Lincoln. I thought, Abraham Lincoln didn't invent that. I'm sure he wouldn't have claimed to come up with that quote. He got that here clearly from the teachings of Jesus. But nonetheless, Jesus here presents this picture that if a kingdom or a nation or a house is divided against itself, it cannot stand. It won't be able to continue on. That's what we see happening here in the nation of Israel. That's what we see in Jerusalem. As they're trying to engage this hard job, there's division amongst the people. The nobles had taken advantage of the common Jews during this time of hard labor and poor harvest. Now I say the nobles because we see that in verse 7. We didn't read it in that first passage we already read. But in verse 7 we see that Nehemiah has to address the nobles to get this problem fixed. The common people say, we're hungry, we're out of money, we need food, and we don't have any way of getting it. We've already had to give up so much. It even talks here in verse 3, it talks about how they mortgaged their lands, their vineyards, and their houses. In verse 5, it says, some of our daughters are brought into bondage already. We've already let some of our children go into slavery. Now I have to clarify. Remember when we say this bondage, this Jewish bondage, remember it would be for a period of time, right? It wasn't like lifelong slavery. This was an agreement to work for someone else for a period of time. They said, we've already given up so much and we can't take care of our families because we're being taken advantage of. And I think, we're going to read the passage here in a moment. I think if we could have gotten a tape recorder on Nehemiah and gotten an exact quote of exactly what he said, it might have been something along the lines of, come on, guys, when speaking to the nobles. How could you do this? How could you take advantage of your own countrymen? We're going through so much. Now, obviously, I'm being a little bit silly, right? We'll read his response to nobles here in a moment. It was a bit more formal than that, but you think that had to be kind of his thought process. How could we do this to our own people? As a matter of fact, let's read those. Verses 6, I believe I broke this up into two sections. Is that correct? Somebody has, starting in verse 6? Will you start us off there, Charles? We'll stop there for now. That's the end of your passage, right, Charles? Yeah. Okay, I want to make sure I had that right. So Nehemiah confronts these nobles, and he says, what are you doing? How can you treat your people this way? We're having to deal with all these outside attacks, and you're taking advantage of your brothers and sisters who are in need? How can you do this to them? And their answer in verse 8 was silence. They had no good reply. When they were called out by Nehemiah, they realized we have no good excuse. In a normal situation, is there anything wrong with having wealth? No. God bless you with wealth. That's great. But when they were using that wealth to take advantage of those who were in need, especially their own brothers and sisters who were in need, Nehemiah confronted them. How can you do this? We've got enough enemies outside. We don't need to have these enemies inside. And we see not only did Nehemiah give this encouragement, this rebuke, but also we see God's blessing. Oftentimes when people make wicked choices and they're confronted with it, their response oftentimes would be to have a stiff neck, as the Bible calls it, right? I'm not going to listen. I can do what I want. It's my life. Leave me alone. No, this is my wealth now. They gave it to me. I'm keeping it. I'm not giving anything back. But as God worked through Nehemiah, they realized, no, we are wrong. We're not showing love to our neighbor. They're giving up so much. They're giving up so much energy and effort and time, and we're not willing to give up anything to help them in return, and realize their own wickedness, their own selfishness, and sought to make things right. In verse 12, they say, so we will do as thou sayest. Nehemiah calls the priests then and has them all take an oath with the priest present to make sure the nobles really stick to their word. You guys made a promise. You're not going to take advantage anymore. You're not going to charge high interests. You're not going to take their children as slaves, even if it's for a few years until the next year of Jubilee. You're not going to do that. You're going to treat them well. You're going to treat them with love and respect. And it says at the end there, it's interesting, he says, I shook my lap and said, so God, shake out every man from his house and from his labor that performeth not this promise, even thus be shaken out and emptied. Kind of an interesting picture, right? You assume he has some sort of robe on, and he shakes it. And as he shakes it, everything that had collected on his robe, which is probably quite a bit of stuff, seeing as how he's wearing this clothing working all the time, lots of bits of stone and rock and dirt and dust, and he shook it off, and it's all gone. It scatters away, it goes away. If you take a rug outside and you shake it to try to clean it, you see dust and little bits of stuff fly everywhere, right? It's no longer on the rug. He says, let God do this to you if you don't keep your word. Let God throw your life out if you don't keep your word, if you don't treat people the way that you ought to. Be accountable. Follow your word here. Follow your promise. Stick to it. So, by God's grace and Nehemiah's boldness to confront these nobles, God delivered them from this really dangerous episode of division. Nehemiah rebuked the Jews. He sought to protect God's reputation. He reminded them of the mercy that they had been shown. They listened, vowed to forgive their debts and to treat their countrymen well. Last thing here, number 4. Sorry, I'm trying to move through this quickly as we're running out of time, so stay with me here, please. Last attack. The 4th episode in Nehemiah chapter 6. I believe we've got Rick and Mark both have one of those. I'm not sure which one of you is first. Could you read, you have 1 through 9? Could you read those for us? Thank you. I did not mean for your passage to be quite so long, but thank you. That was great. Appreciate that. The last threat here, last threat we're going to look at today was the threat of scheming enemies. They're still the same enemies, but they've realized that using verbal attacks and intimidation will not work. They've seen that even if the Jews have some division amongst themselves, they'll work it out. So they can't do some sort of divide and conquer sort of thing here. They can't try to divide the Israelites against themselves. So finally they turn to this trickery, this scheming. And over again, I believe the count was 4 times, they said to Nehemiah, hey, we have something we need to talk to you about. Come on out and come talk to us. Okay? Nehemiah's response is, I can't leave. There's work to be done. But they keep trying. They try to trick Nehemiah into leaving the work. Now, this would have had 2 different effects. The first effect, the Bible tells us, is really this was an attempt at assassination. We're going to get him away from the people. We know that all of the Jews are on the wall of Jerusalem, all of them building, but also carrying swords with them. We don't want an outright attack. Plus, as I already mentioned, we don't want to get in trouble with King Artaxerxes. But if Nehemiah comes to us and it just so happens there was an accident while he was away from the people and he died, well, so be it. And if they lose their leader, then they certainly can't finish, which, by the way, it's an interesting side thought to me. It's a little bit off topic. God chose to use Nehemiah to build this wall. Had Nehemiah died, could God have still finished the project? Yeah, he could have chosen another servant. I think that's important for us to remember, not to think too highly of ourselves. Whatever God chooses to do through us, that's great, but we're just servants. And if God were to call us home, well, he can do his work through other people as well. In the meantime, we should be grateful he's chosen to use us and continue to serve him. But Nehemiah didn't fall for this trap. He didn't go. He said, there's work to be done. I can't go. But this also would have been an opportunity to hurt Nehemiah's reputation. Look, when all the work has to be done, Nehemiah just bailed on you people. And if they could get the people to turn against their leader, they thought maybe that will give us a window of opportunity and the walls will no longer be built and we can have absolute control over this area again. So they tried to use some trickery, some deceit to hurt Nehemiah's standing by getting him to come and then also by getting him to go hide in the temple. Let's make Nehemiah look like a bad leader. Let's make him look like he's scared. Let's make him look like he's fearful, because no one wants to follow a man like that, they thought. But again, thankfully, it didn't work. 2 responses here. Integrity and firmness. Nehemiah said, no, I'm not going to leave. We're in the middle of a job. A good leader, I'm not going to bail on all my men right when we're trying to finish up this huge task. I'm going to stick with them. We're going to work through this together. We're going to get this done. Nehemiah may have been suspicious, perhaps, that his health, his safety might be at risk if he left, but he doesn't even address that, right? He just says, no, I've got work to do. I'm not coming to see you. God gave Nehemiah wisdom to protect his life, and also gave him wisdom to avoid damaging his reputation by fleeing into the temple and looking as though he was scared of the enemy and using the temple as his own personal fortress. If the enemy is trying to say that Nehemiah is trying to make himself a king and he starts taking up residence in the temple, that would probably look like it was lending them some credence. Look, he's acting like a king. He's not acting like just a common person, and it damaged his reputation. And by God's grace and God's leading in his life, he didn't walk into either of these situations. And just to look ahead, 1 verse we'll look at next week, but verse 15. So the wall was finished in the 20th and 5th day, the month Elul, in 52 days. So we see, despite all these attacks from the outside, all these divisions from the inside, they still finished. And by God's grace also, we were able to finish 2.5 chapters today. It's a long section. I really appreciate all the help with everybody's reading. Just a real quick summary here. When he was faced with ridicule, he responded with prayer and determination. When he was opposed with discouragement, he responded with faith and strategy. Opposed by greed, he responded with confrontation and restitution with the nobles there. When he was opposed by schemes, he responded with integrity and firmness, which leads us to kind of a summary of the last section today, to handle opposition with faith and skill. When the opposition came, he did his part. He used his skill to protect his people and to build the wall. but ultimately he was responding in faith. God gave us this task. He's going to enable us to finish it. Our memory verse for this week, if you'd say it with me. Nehemiah 5:9. Also I said, it is not good that ye do. Ought ye not to walk in the fear of our God, because of the reproach of our heathen, our enemies. I got tongue-tied there. We see here, this is way back when he was talking to the nobles, and he says, to avoid reproach of God, to avoid God's reproach, to protect God's name and God's character, let's treat each other well. Let's treat each other with love. Next week, we'll move on to lesson number 8, giving God the glory. We had to cover 2.5 chapters today, and notice tomorrow or next Sunday we've got like 4 verses. So that should be a little bit easier. Shouldn't have quite as much reading to do next Sunday, but something we can look forward to. Glorifying God for his faithfulness through this difficult task. Any questions? I went a little bit long today. I tried to go fast, and I still went a little bit long because we had a lot to cover. But any questions before we close? Comments? Observations? All right. Well, Brother Rick, since we didn't get to your reading, would you mind closing us with prayer?